Well, good morning or good evening or good afternoon to you all, depending on where you are. It's good afternoon from me here in Dubai, where I'm situated. And welcome to this edition of the CIPS MENA Ask the CPO series of webinars. My name's Sam Achampong. I'm the Regional Director for CIPS Middle East and North Africa. Pleased to have you all. Ask the CPO is an opportunity for you to ask in a live environment all of those questions you've always wanted to put to senior procurement leaders. And today we have a great guest who's agreed to join us here for the first in the Ask the CPO series. James Westgarth, otherwise known as the Aviation CPO, had a wide career, and on the screen there you can see some of the roles he's undertaken from a senior perspective in his career. Head of Procurement at Air Arabia, Sourcing Director at Lufthansa, Head of General Procurement at Airbus, amongst many others. Now, this is a live session. You have an opportunity to ask those questions directly to James, who will introduce shortly. But to interact generally during the session, you can use the chat function, which you can see on your screen. If you want to ask direct questions to James, which we'll put to him, use the Q&A box. Just type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll pick up your questions from there. We do also have a number of questions that have been emailed to us before this session, so we'll also hopefully get a chance to pick up on those as well. But this is a session, this is a chance for you all to put your questions to a CPO, and for that purpose today we have James Westgarth. James, welcome to Ask the CPO. How are you?
Great. Hello, Sam, and good afternoon to you. It's great to talk to you again, Sam. And we're still in January, so Happy New Year to you, wishing you all the best, and Happy New Year to all everybody who's joining us from around the region and maybe even from around the world. Everything fine. Looking forward to this session, Sam. So thank you very much for having me.
Great, and we're live on LinkedIn. We're live in several areas, and obviously we're live here on Zoom. So yeah, this is really an opportunity for people to ask the questions. But you know what? Just to kick off, James, maybe just talk us through. Tell us a little bit about. We've got your career on screen, but talk to us a little bit about how you got there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a great question. Yeah, and I often love to hear about the career paths of different peers in the procurement sector, because of course, as we all know, when you're 5 years old, you never say, hey, mum, hey, dad, I want to be a CPO later in life. So you arriving in the procurement field is always very interesting to hear. In my own case, when I came out of university, I did my master's, and then I went straight into a consulting role in Paris, in France. And there I was doing two main things. And this was in 1999, long time ago. Hopefully many people on the call way too young to remember those days. And I was working on two things. I was working on Y2K. I'm not sure if anybody remembers that. So this was the dreaded bug that was going to ensure the end of the world at the stroke of midnight on the 31st of December, 1999. And the other thing I was working on was SAP projects, and that's what got me involved in SAP procurement. So back in the day, this was SAP FI, SAP MM, and then that led me to work for a company called Amadeus. It's a software company specialized in the travel industry, and there I was working on an SAP travel management solution. And then I worked for a short while in Australia, also for Amadeus, as kind of an implementation guy on the marketing side. So there's still no sign of procurement at that time. And that brings us up to 2005, when I then joined Airbus. And I joined Airbus in order to implement Airbus's travel management system, so travel booking, expense management, corporate card, and so on. And of course, that's when I first had my first insights into procurement, because the travel management was part of the travel procurement, and I took over the travel procurement side as well. And then that grew exponentially to take over where I got insights into other indirect procurement categories, and the rest, they say, is history. And then in 2016, I went to the US to transform a procurement organization in the indirect procurement there, again for Airbus. And then I moved to Lufthansa in 2018, again linked to a relationship, because I came into Lufthansa AirPlus, a subsidiary of Lufthansa, who was actually a supplier to Airbus, again linked to the travel management side of things. And then I was asked to set up a new sourcing department there. And then in 2020, of course, we had a minor pandemic which hit the world, and at that time I was seconded into the central procurement team of the Lufthansa Group to project manage the crisis management team from a procurement perspective in what Lufthansa called the cash office. And then a couple of years later, I decided to move out here to the Middle East, and I joined Air Arabia. So in a nutshell, that's my potted history of my career. I'm very happy to be working in procurement. I think procurement's a great place to be. I think just about every news story that you read or you listen to involves somehow a procurement or a supply chain dimension. So it's great to be at the cutting edge.
You just covered what, 20 plus years and several continents and several organizations, categories and companies in about 5 minutes. That's got to be a record. Well done for that, James. I think there's been a lot of condensation, I'm sure, or rather, that's the wrong word, just condensing your history into
absolutely
amount of time. Thanks for the information. I think a lot of people will be really keen to get into the nitty gritty as to what you do. So we'll kick off with one of the questions that came into us early, which was obviously you're a CPO. Talk us through your day-to-day, day in the life of a chief procurement officer.
Absolutely. So
give the guys some insights.
Absolutely. It's I guess the cliched answer to that question is that there is never any single typical day. However, what I would say is that the day-to-day is dimensioned by certain factors and certain elements which I try to implement. So I always like to, as a CPO, I'm always interested in the strategic view. I'm always interested in being an ambassador for the procurement organization within the organization that I'm working in, and also an ambassador for my team. I want to ensure that the team, the buyers, the category managers, the supplier relationship managers, all of these people have as smooth a ride as possible. And it's my job to kind of clear the way, let's say, and make sure that there is as less resistors in the way as possible. So my day-to-day involves, I would say more from a week-to-week perspective, is more kind of assessing how can I raise the profile of procurement in my organization. Which stakeholders do I need to convince on specific topics? I'm interested to work on things which are important rather than urgent. Of course, that's not always the case, because there's always an RFP that needs finalizing, or a contract that needs to be negotiated, or a supplier escalation topic. But just generally keeping in mind what is in the best interests of the business overall. And I would also say, over time, as my career has grown, as I've developed over the many years, the percentage of my day which is dedicated to, I would say, people activities has increased. So today, well over 50% of my time is dedicated to sitting down with my team members, either collectively or individually, ensuring that they are comfortable, that they have a safe space for limited risk taking, making sure that they have the necessary resources to do the job, if different team members need support in one way or the other. So it's more from a facilitation perspective. So I think I'm a great fan of Stephen Covey, and his 7 habits. And I always say that, you know, you always have to put your big rocks into your jar first of all, before your little rocks, because then if the jar is a representation of the time that you have in the day, you know, do what's the top priority first of all, and then going through your emails in order of the time that you receive the email is probably the last thing to do. So not to be distracted too much by social media. Yeah.
You know what? I think the last thing you said is probably one of the most poignant. You know, real life history and real life problems. I think we've got actually a few good shouts there. You know, to Stephen Covey. So I guess people out there take that away as probably a good management reference. And I think some really good takeaways in terms of what you do and the different balances you have now in a leadership position, especially in terms of dedicating that time to your people as opposed to you know, the technical day to day. So I guess that's the takeaway. I'll go into one of the questions we have, and actually one of the questions we have relates to the Middle East, but I'll point out we do actually have callers or people on the webinar from all around the world. I think we got people from just rolling through here, probably from the UAE, Oman, KSA, Bangladesh, UK, Sudan, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Kuwait, to mention quite a few. But the question I'll go to is, in your opinion, James, what is today's #1 issue facing food exporters to the Middle East?
Yeah, I think so. The good news, I think, first of all, before I come on to the challenge, is that what we're seeing more and more now is that the inflation that we've seen over the past couple of years is coming down. So I think the latest global figures on food inflation has shown a significant decrease in the past 6 months. But of course, we have to remember that just because inflation is at 3% and not at 10% doesn't mean the prices are going down. It just means that they're increasing at a slightly less volatile rate or a less radical rate than they were in the past. So I think price inflation is still important, but of course, linked to that, you've got issues in the supply chain. So I think, and of course, knowing some geopolitical events that are currently ongoing in this region and indeed around the world, I think we're still in very volatile times. And I think, you know, what we know from the massive increases in insurance premiums for shipping, for example, you know, where we talk about increases by a factor of 70, so 70 in insurance premiums, based on the volatile situation in this region and also around the world. You know, this leads to increases in price, and of course it means that the savings targets that we want to achieve is not so good. I think yeah, so that's I see the main challenge for food exporters into the region right now. Of course, you know, and then there are changing fashions or tastes, I would say, in terms of what foods are there. I think there is an increasing awareness about the environmental impact of food transportation, of the food cost from around the world. And I think in one way that is a little bit misunderstood, because in many ways, of course, when you do the business case, you know, the environmental impact of the transport is offset by the content. So it's more important to understand what you eat rather than where the food is coming from in many cases. So yeah, but yeah, so that's my take on that topic.
So basically a number of concerns for people, you know, importing food importers into the Middle East. I guess you're talking environmental concerns, the traditional cost concerns in terms of price instability, and other environmental factors. But I mean, would you say you've worked around the world? Would you say there's anything unique in food export procurement or food import procurement to the Middle East, or do you think it's quite uniform across the world?
No, of course, I think so. I mean, of course, in the past 20 years, we've seen a good deal of globalization. I would say it's fairly homogenous around the world. Of course, particularly here in the UAE and in Dubai, of course, we're in an extremely cosmopolitan setup where we have, we are still highly reliant on food imports, but I think the necessary security measures are well in place. We don't see any food shortages here, so I think I think this is a risk that is easily mitigated. But yeah, so it's fairly homogenous.
Fantastic. Great. Let me go on to, an often asked question, especially in procurement sessions, but I guess you can give it an aviation twist because, every sector is not the same. But the question is, how do you balance the traditional focus on cost savings with the need to drive value and innovation through procurement in aviation?
Yeah, I think so. So cost is always a factor. I mean, we should not forget that. I think, we've seen cost pressures in the past, well, more or less since the end of COVID. And in the aviation sector in particular, because what happened during COVID, of course, there was massive layoffs in the aviation industry, and supply chains were significantly disrupted. A lot of people in the supply chain, a lot of experts left the aviation industry to other industries or to retirement, so the great resignation, so to say, and that left a lot of risk in the supply chain. And we found, and certainly, in my experience, 2022, 2023, and even into this year, we still see the legacy of that in terms of the disruption. So, and what that means is that there are increases in lead times. You have to have a very strong interaction with strategic suppliers to understand where the risks are, where the delays are. And then, of course, in terms of costs, energy costs, general inflation. So you have a kind of double whammy of goods not being delivered on time, with a huge backlog, and the goods themselves are much more expensive. So the question is, how do you mitigate that? And the measures, I think, that's applicable not only to aviation but to many different industries as well, is you can have different strategies, and this is really where we start to see the real value of procurement. So in terms of things like dual sourcing, in terms of what we call now friendshoring, in terms of in radical cases, you can even duplicate certain parts of the supply chain. But I would also say, being much more pragmatic, you can also just interact much more intensively with your strategic suppliers to understand where the risks are, being much more proactive, and working more in a kind of partnership mode. So doing your typical, segmentation of your supply base, and to understand which suppliers you need to develop, which suppliers you need to partnership with, which suppliers you need to let go. So putting into place all the sorts of things that you learn in your CIPS qualification, and making happen. And this is absolutely true. It's the reality of what we've seen in the past 24 months. I remember I remember traveling once on a flight from Krakow in Poland to Frankfurt, and there was so much frustration in the supply chain that the pilot actually named the supplier that was unable to deliver the catering to the aircraft. Which of course normally wouldn't happen. That'd be completely unprofessional. But you could tell in the pilot's voice when he announced it that there would be no food on the flight today because so and so simply hasn't been able to find a driver to, And this is very, I would say, symptomatic of the wider issues that we faced post-COVID in the aviation supply chain. And I know, in pharmaceuticals and in food and in many other sectors, in chemicals and healthcare, there have been similar experiences. So I'm optimistic for the future. I think in 2024 and beyond, these wrinkles in the supply chain can be ironed out. I think we will come back, on the one hand, to a much more professional, much more robust supply chain. I'm also a little bit concerned because I'm not sure if we've really learned the lessons from COVID. I mean, you have to ask yourself in your organization, if COVID happened again tomorrow, do we really have the resilience internally? Do we really have the resilience in our supply chain? Are we robust enough from a working capital and a cash management perspective? I'm not so sure that in a lot of cases this is the case. So we still have some way to go. And of course, the issues which are now becoming solved are then replaced by new issues. So there's never a dull moment in procurement. Now we have, when I look at the geopolitical landscape for this year, for example, I mean, we've got, there's a lot of elections around the world. And you have to imagine that, if Trump comes back at the end of the year, wins the election, what does that mean for running a deficit in the US economy? What does it mean for trade? What does it mean for trade barriers and so forth? And all of this has a procurement and a supply chain dimension. So, and that's just one example. I mean, there's all sorts of things going on, so which we need to be aware of.
And there's just so many factors that you need to take into account when you're in your position, especially in aviation, because I think there's so many moving parts and some great insights about the post-COVID environment, of course, because we know some airlines certainly are probably back to their pre-COVID position from a revenue perspective. But it's interesting to hear you say that in some cases, some organizations haven't quite learnt all the lessons of COVID. And I think that's probably a lesson to all procurement people out there to just look at what happened in COVID. Don't forget, talk about resilience. Resilience is a big thing, I think you mentioned. And also, traditional things like keeping close to your suppliers. But just in terms of going back to airlines, in terms of airlines and procurement, do you have different sectors within airlines in how you manage procurement? So you have your budget airlines, you have your large international carriers. Is being at the helm of procurement, are there different strategies to those different types of operation, or is it pretty much the same?
Yeah, I think so. So I think the first thing to say is it doesn't matter what type of airline you're running, whether it's a traditional, what we call a legacy flag carrier, or a low-cost carrier, or somewhere in between. In procurement or in general, you're purchasing more or less the same things. So you have the technical engineering procurement for maintenance and overhaul of the aircraft. You have your all the elements related to your passenger experience, so how the cabin looks like, the catering, the in-flight entertainment, and so forth. And then you have all of your IT, and then you have, of course, all of your indirect procurement, and then you have things like your airport charges, your ground handling, and all airlines will encounter this. The nuances come in, I would say, what focus there is on cost versus other factors. So and how a procurement organization in an airline organizes itself. So what procurement activities does it delegate to the business? What procurement activities are centralized within the procurement organization or not? Or you could have a decentralized organization which is more regionally based. And you have to decide what you're doing. For example, in a lot of activities which have a high spend, but are quite specific in terms of the nature of how that money is spent. So, for example, in fuel. So in fuel procurement, in many cases, there is a strong hedging aspect to fuel. And therefore, some airlines give the procurement of the fuel to the treasury, the finance organization. Ground handling and airport charges. In some airlines, it seems, well, because this is in many cases, these are monopolistic suppliers, so the value add of procurement is limited. My own view is a bit different, of course, because I say if you have a monopolistic supplier, probably the value of procurement is, if anything, better, because then you know how to handle that supplier, you know how to develop that supplier, how to perhaps break the monopoly eventually. And the supplier relationship management, which is of course a key part of the procurement profession, is best handled in procurement. So that's my own personal view. So how the organization is structured to handle these common elements of procurement that all airlines have, is very interesting to see compared to what you see in the US with, Delta or United. And I know that, Air Canada does its procurement a little bit different to Etihad, which does it a little bit different to Air Arabia, which does it different to EasyJet. So yeah, but yes. And I think this is why it's very important in procurement that we establish networks and we interact with each other. And I'm very happy, Sam, that you established the airline and logistics working group here in the MENA region, because this provides a forum for us all to exchange. And it's funny when I talk to counterparts in Emirates or Qatar Airways or whoever it may be, obviously on a purely non-competitive basis, but you just exchange and you see what some of the differences are, and then sometimes you say, oh yeah, maybe we could do it a little bit different this way or that way. One example is how you can consolidate different categories of spend which are traditionally very disparate, very separate, and if you combine them together into a cluster or a category which you can call customer experience or passenger experience, that creates a lot of synergies, because it highlights that if you're thinking in procurement from a passenger perspective, and you're combining the procurement of your cabin seats and your in-flight entertainment and your catering and your cabin lighting, so to ensure that there is a common brand, and and traditionally, maybe your in-flight entertainment might have been procured by an IT buyer, and your seats procurement may have not even been procured by anybody in procurement. It may have been done by someone else in marketing. And for bringing that together gives a much better brand experience for the passenger. So so that's just one example. So you think, how can I procure better in the interests of not only cost, and not only ensuring the bottom line is as positive as it can be, but also in terms of the value that procurement can bring to the business. And for me, that is the ultimate goal. I think I always tend to talk about the pyramid of procurement excellence, and at the bottom you've got your basic needs for procurement in terms of operations, P2P, purchase order placement. But as you move up the pyramid in terms of challenging specifications, working closely with the demand organization, and then getting to the top of the pyramid and then saying, well, how can procurement as a function go out to the supplier market and obtain innovation and obtain competitive advantage for the organization? And that's what's really exciting about being in this business in procurement, because you can sit down with the supplier who's and okay, you can give them a hard time on their contract performance, but then you can probably have the last 10 minutes of a conversation to say, well, what are you doing in R&D right now? What are you developing that I can then go back into our organization and say, hey, did you know these guys are developing this? And it means that we can, we can have an in-flight entertainment system that, knocks the socks off the competition if we partner with this supplier, and that's the real value. That's what's really exciting about procurement.
I think that's a great example of how procurement adds value, and that's well articulated. Thanks for that, James. It really does show how all these moving parts can be brought together with some procurement expertise. And you're right, that's what we're all here for at the end of the day. Costs. I remember doing a series of webinars and speaking to a load of people during COVID, and in all industries, including the kind of aviation and logistics kind of industries. There were obviously huge surges in costs. So costs of goods, costs of logistics as well, actually, in certain cases. Is that still the case in aviation? Are you still dealing with cost surges? And if you are, how are you mitigating those?
Yeah, so I think, so cost is always an issue. Cost will never go away. I think I'm hopeful that inflation goes down, but on the other hand, if never waste a good crisis, as I say. And if you have high rising costs, then senior stakeholders in the organization tend to see the value of procurement in terms of being able to mitigate those costs. So in aviation, yes, we've seen big cost increases in the past, well, since COVID, more or less, generally. But the underlying factors which drive this are different. So for example, in aviation, you can have many suppliers who are based outside of the region. So you have suppliers who are based in Europe, for example, and in Europe, there's been huge increases in energy costs. And then the energy costs are then translated into increases in prices. And that can have impacts in areas where you would never think. So for example, in the purchase of material for the carpets in the aircraft. This is to produce the carpets is highly energy intensive, and this has high cost impacts. So mitigating that means looking globally to suppliers which you may have not considered before. It also means thinking innovatively about things like logistics, customs clearance, how you inventory management in terms of how much cash do you want to tie up versus the operational need. So you need to, take all of these factors into consideration. Traditional procurement tactics, for example, like looking to dual source certain components, thinking about looking into different markets. Yeah, so there's always ways that you can seek to reduce cost. Also, of course, thinking about synergies inside the business and how procurement has the overview across multiple functions. And therefore procurement can come in with ideas to say, okay, well, we use this supplier for this activity in reservation IT, but that same IT supplier can be useful in, I don't know, in managing our finances system or something like this. So you kind of, by having that kind of overview, you can look for synergies as well. So you have to be very innovative. I think we've now, since COVID, we've been almost 2 years out of COVID, or perhaps a little bit more. So the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. So you have to be more and more innovative about where you get cost savings, and simply mitigating inflation has been I think a key challenge. And of course that's not good for the CFO, because the CFO doesn't see the underlying EBIT impact. If you're just mitigating inflation, you say, I would go to a CFO and say, hey, instead of 10%, it's now only 2% price increase, and as well, a price increase is still a price increase, right? So you have to, I think, but again, I say I'm optimistic. I think by the end of this year, global inflation should be significantly reduced, barring any unforeseen events, and therefore, the real cost saving value add of procurement can become much more visible once again.
Innovation, and when is a cost saving not a cost saving? So
absolutely. I once heard from a CPO who said, we have to turn procurement from a place where it is impossible to find innovation to a place where it is impossible to avoid innovation. And I think that's something I always bear in mind. You have to be innovative, not only in your approaches to the suppliers, but also in terms of your processes, your tools, and so forth. Yeah.
100%. I love that quote. We'll have to get that CPO in as well to our Ask the CPO series, even though we've already blown his or her trumpet. Going back to the questions, again, post-COVID. So the question from Wilfred is, post-COVID, obviously has caused has caused significant production disruptions amongst manufacturers, and obviously affecting the order book. So, yep. and obviously where you're causing manufacturing disruptions, affecting the order book, access to material, stock, prices are affected, and the ongoing issues to the company they're serving. What Wilfred is asking for are what are the strategies and mitigations from a procurement point of view that an airline can implement to secure the supply or to secure the operations from the supply.
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that you can do. I think first of all, of course, is to secure excellent contractual terms. This is not always possible, of course, but where it is possible, you can have beneficial impacts. So you can have, for example, preferred customer status in your contracts. So when a part becomes available or when a disruption in the supply chain is solved, then the first cab off the rank, or the first piece of material is then guaranteed for you as the customer. You can also above and beyond the contractual side of things, I think what's key, and what in my experience at least, is that what's important is to get under the skin of the supply chain. So making the effort to go out and visit strategic suppliers, understand what their issues are, put into place mitigation plans, and show willingness and understanding up to a certain degree, of course, to ensure that those mitigation and action plans are then undertaken and implemented. And I think as a customer, if you show willingness and understanding in a firm but fair way, you get positive results. So, I mean, in the aviation industry, there's been a lot of issues, for example, with engine management, engine overhaul, very little capacity in the supply chain, a lot of even poaching of engineers between one supplier to another, and really just digging a hole to fill in another hole in many cases, and of course, as an airline operator, you have to be very sensitive to that. But in the end, the solution is to go and see your supplier and say, okay, we understand you've got an issue. Let's work on an action plan to get things sorted out. Let's bring down the turnaround times and get back on track contractually. And in most cases, this tends to work. Of course, you always have as a last resort, breach of contract, putting a supplier onto a recovery plan, doing the typical sorts of things that, once again, you learn about in your CIPS courses, in terms of handling a failing supplier, dual sourcing and so forth. But these are really last resort topics. I think. I wouldn't go so far as to say as a contract is a document which is signed and forgotten and never to be used again. I don't agree with that at all. But the last resort is really the last resort in terms of making a claim or suing the supplier. Yeah, you're probably in a very bad place if you have to get there. Yeah.
And great insights. Supplies in the aviation industry, apart from the general categories, any major differences in aviation in terms of managing and working with suppliers?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, the aviation industry is quite specific. I mean, the famous quote from, I think, Richard Branson was to say that to make money in the aviation business, or to make $1 million in the aviation business, is very easy. You just have to start with $1 billion. So everybody's very cost conscious. The supply chain in aviation is extremely global. So if you're an airline based here in the Middle East, you are sending out your parts for repair to all over the world. So you need to ensure that your supply chain is very robust and very resilient. And you need to have strong communication with strategic suppliers at all times. I think, of course, obviously one key element of the aviation supply chain is the commitment to safety. Of course, we're all aware of what happened at the beginning of the year on the Alaska Airlines flight. So previous incidents. So there has to be. It's always safety first. And then you have to think about other considerations. So unfortunately, in the aviation business, it is very safe. I mean, it's well known that, if you're going to take the plane, the most dangerous part of the journey is getting the taxi to the airport. So I think and because of the need for safety, it's very much regulated. So you have to ensure that the regulatory requirements are met, with regards to your parts and so on. And even in indirect procurement, sometimes, because of the nature of the aviation business. But what's very interesting is now we're starting to see some additional factors coming into play in the area of sustainability, of course, which previously wasn't even a factor, and more widely, the ESG topic is coming more and more. Sustainable aviation fuel, hydrogen powered aircraft, and so on. So these are all things that are coming up again, that makes life so interesting in this business. So never a dull moment.
Great, and I think that Richard Branson quote was something like, how do you make $1 million in the airline industry?
Absolutely.
Invest 1 billion, yeah, something along those lines. I can't remember that one. So great. So you mentioned sustainability, and I guess we'll touch on that. Hot topic at the moment: sustainability or ESG, whichever angle you want to address it from. But I think you touched on it before, and you probably answered the question slightly. But do you see procurement within the industry, within the air travel or aviation industry, actually contributing to sustainability? And if so, how?
I think there's one very clear answer to that question, and that's yes, absolutely. I think because we are the entry point to the supply chain. First of all, we can get access to the latest innovations and technology in sustainable solutions, and I think now we're more or less getting to a tipping point. Not only in aviation, but in all sorts of other industries, where it becomes more economic to take the sustainable option rather than the non-sustainable option. So there's also a business, case there. But having those inroads into the supply chain are very important. So and it's a two-way street. So you can take on board the sustainable initiatives that are being developed across the supply chain, but you can also act as a lobbying force into the supply chain to say, hey, if you want me to work with you in the future, you're going to have to be more sustainable. And of course, it depends on the category, it depends on the supplier, depends on the geography, about what we mean and how ambitious we are in terms of sustainability. But nevertheless, the message is there, the principle is there, and you can do things like, you could say, whenever I run an RFP, 10% of my selection criteria should be based on sustainable criteria, or more. It depends on which industry you work on, and so forth. So I think you also need to be pragmatic, and I would say give some gentle words of wisdom inside the organization. So, for example, a lot of people have seen sustainable aviation fuel as the panacea, as the kind of thing which is going to solve and save aviation going forward. But of course, anybody working in aviation in this part of the world knows that there's very little supply, and the price point is way too high. I think it was the CEO of Ryanair who said that there isn't enough used cooking oil in the world produced in 1 year to power 1 day's worth of aviation. So you have to also be pragmatic, look for the right solutions. I think of course, aviation gets a bad rap because it's very visible. Historically, we've always said that aviation contributes 2% of carbon dioxide globally. I think probably that figure's a bit higher now, more like in the 5% range. But if you compare that to, let's say, agriculture, which I think is in the 20 to 25% range, it gives you an idea. But nevertheless, I think it's very important that aviation is part of the solution and not part of the problem, in all sorts of ways. So how we're, and in procurement, today, each one of my buyers and supply chain managers, we're working with suppliers, not necessarily on doing something disruptive, but maybe optimizing the weight of a cabin component. And if you save 1 kilogram or 500 grams even on a seat or on a cabin monument, over the lifetime of the use of the aircraft, that saves so much fuel that in the end, it has a huge beneficial impact. So, and that can range for things like, all sorts of things that you see on the aircraft, from catering through to cabin monuments, through to all kinds of things, emergency slides, which are actually very, very heavy, so any weight saving on an emergency slide, is worth investigating simply because of the fuel saving. Yeah.
I mean, that's interesting. And I mean, what methods do you have to kind of, I guess, first of all, evaluate and also articulate some of these sustainable inputs that you mentioned? Because they're obviously offsetting emissions, as you said, they're offsetting the sustainability element. How are you able to articulate that and also calculate those when speaking to stakeholders or suppliers?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, Sam. And I have to say, I don't have a comprehensive answer for you at this stage, simply because it depends very much on what you're buying, and it also depends on what your definition of sustainability is. So if you're focusing on emissions and environmental impact of in terms of sustainability, then yes, you can probably calculate, what over the life cycle of an aircraft or over the life cycle of a contract, what CO2 saving that represents, or what emissions can be offset. Yes, you can certainly do that. In other areas, when I think about sustainability more generally, or ESG more generally, it becomes more difficult. So, for example, I think it's very important in the aviation industry that we work with local suppliers, for example, or we work with small suppliers, or we work with disability-friendly suppliers. I'll give you an example. When I was in the USA, I always remember United Airlines. They always provide you with a little cookie when you get on the plane. And those cookies are coming from a supplier that is a well-known disability-friendly organization. And again, measuring the impact of that, or even versus the economic impact is quite difficult. And I know there are software companies out there that are trying to kind of quantify this. And there are a number out there who are, particularly on the environmental side, to say, okay, across all of your supply chain, this is your carbon footprint. But I think the jury is still out. We have to rely on our friends in the procurement technology community to solve that issue. I think also we're also encouraged in procurement, or we're forced in many ways to act simply because of the legislative frameworks are changing. So, for example, in Germany last year, there was the Supply Chain Act, which came into force, where you are legally obliged to know who the suppliers of your suppliers are, going deep into the supply chain, and it makes the directors of the organization criminally liable if there is a problem in ESG, going into tier 4 or tier 5. And I think that's very much a precursor. I think at in the EU level now, there's a similar piece of legislation being prepared. So anybody in the MENA region wanting to do business, with the EU in the future will have to, think about how to make the supply chain as transparent as it can possibly be, in the interests of just simply meeting the legislative requirements. Yeah.
And it just shows some of the challenges that are coming, and the fact that we're now a global village. It's not limited to certain continents or regions. Some of the legislative requirements are global. We had this before with things like fraud and ethics and things along those lines. It doesn't matter.
Absolutely. Data protection Yeah, don't talk to me about GDPR. Oh my goodness. So yeah.
That was my next question, but now I'll move on then. We'll talk about technology. We'll talk about technology. Tell us, James. So, what are some of the emerging trends or technologies, or whether they're emerging or already in use, that you believe will have the most significant impact, or is already having a significant impact on procurement or within the aviation industry?
Sure. So I think I'm very excited about technology. I'm a bit of a tech nerd, to be honest, and I like finding out what the latest suppliers have in store for us from a procurement technology perspective. And in procurement, I think there's always been the debate whether you go for one of these platform providers or whether you go for kind of best in class, best of breed, depending on what part of the procurement process you're trying to digitalize. What I've certainly seen in the past 12 months is the real use of AI, which makes me very happy, because AI for me was a very abstract term until ChatGPT came along, and a lot of people were saying, yes, this is your fridge can be AI, and I have no idea why I would want an AI empowered fridge. But what I've seen certainly in the past year is a number of suppliers coming to the table where, for example, you receive a contract from a supplier, and then the AI algorithm, once you load it up, can assess whether that contract fits to your contract clauses, in your contract library, and flag up any major discrepancies and so forth. You still need the procurement person there, and you still need the legal person there to make these judgment calls, but it makes a process that was that perhaps would have taken days that you can now do in minutes, and that's really cool. And I'm optimistic about that, because of course the contract management side of things, it sits very much at the center of the process cycle of procurement. So I'm hoping, for want of a better expression, that this kind of innovation in contract management can infect the rest of the cycle, and then you start to really leverage AI opportunities. Of course, you have to have I would say a dose of skepticism. Not everything can be AI enabled, but yeah. The other thing which I think is important, and I think we will see more maturity there, is spend analysis and data management being exploited much more, and more technological solutions coming into place to deliver real value add from spend data. I've implemented a number of spend management solutions in my time, and I have to admit, in the past, a bit underwhelmed by what comes out of the machine. You spend 6 months implementing a system, and then in the end you say, oh, is that it? I just know that I'm spending X million of dollars with this supplier, and I already knew that. But I think going forward, there are solutions in place which will enable us to really understand what's going on in the supply chain at a very deep level. So say, for example, a factory in Canada has an issue and has to go offline for 2 weeks. Then hopefully in the future, the data will enable us to say, well, that factory going offline will impact your supply chain in this area, that area, and that area, because that factory is actually supplying 30, that factory that's a tier 3 supplier is actually supplying 30 of your tier 2 suppliers, and that can have an exponential impact. Yeah. So that's the optimistic side. I think the traditional players, the SAPs and the Coopers and the Oracles and there are others out there. I think they will need to step up in the next months and years to meet our needs. I think that there is kind of we need to kind of make a step change in that area. I think we've had the same functionality pretty much for a few years now, and therefore it's time to think about what technological opportunities and innovations there are to make our lives not necessarily easier, but more value adding in procurement. And this comes back to what I said earlier about delivering competitive advantage from the supply chain into the organization, and how we can leverage technology to do that. It comes down to things like how to ensure that procurement is valued. And this is another one of my missions in life, is to ensure that procurement is valued in the organization. In procurement, we're very good at buying. We are a tribe of buyers in procurement, but we also have to be good at selling. We have to be good at selling ourselves to the organization, the value of procurement. And more these days, our shop window, procurement's shop window, is our technology. It's our ordering systems, it's our interfaces to finance, it's our contract management software. These are the things which stakeholders external to procurement see on a day-to-day basis. So we have to make sure that not only is our technology profound and value-adding, but it's also user-friendly, and people come to procurement because they want to, not because they have to.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I think that great quote at the end. I think that's really what people need to do. They need to come to procurement voluntarily, and not because they're following some sort of process. But also, going back to what you said about procurement technology, I think the next breed of procurement technology, whether it's AI based or better, needs to be the result of a consultation between the developers and senior procurement practitioners, because it almost seems as if systems that were built before have been built in isolation, and that's why you end up with organizations who have different ERP platforms have to do procurement in a different way, and that can't be the way forward. But anyway, great observation. I'm going to go from technology to, we've only got a few minutes left, so I'll go from technology to people. And the question that came in saying, how can a non-aviation procurement person transition into aviation procurement? I mean, is there such a thing? I mean, do you need to have specific skills to be in aviation procurement, or do you need to be a well-rounded procurement professional and you can kind of add value as you can? What's your opinion?
So the first thing is to say, don't worry. If you want to go into aviation as a procurement professional, there's no kind of secret initiation rite that you have to go through. There's no physical pain involved, I can assure you. No, I think this is the great thing about procurement. Procurement, as a procurement professional, you have a lot of interdisciplinary skills which cut across different industries. And it's like anything, really. You can, if you're interested in getting into the aviation world, as a procurement person, you can start off maybe getting into indirect procurement, because indirect procurement in aviation is very similar to indirect procurement anywhere else. And then, of course, once you're inside the door, then you can build up your technical expertise. If you're an aviation nerd like me, then you start to become more familiar with the specifics of aviation, and either whether that's from a purely technical perspective, of course, from if you're doing engineering procurement, or whether it's to do with the nuances of the aviation industry. So if you're doing a ground handling procurement, or negotiating with airports, for example. So no, there are plenty of opportunities there, and I think if you're interested, if you show the enthusiasm and you want to autonomously climb the pyramid of procurement excellence that I mentioned earlier, you're more than welcome into our industry, because we need more people like that.
Great answer. I mean, I tend to agree wholeheartedly. I actually tend to think that talented procurement people coming from different sectors probably add more value to a new sector. Because they're not shoehorned, they're not thinking about the same thing in the same way that other, let's say, aviation professionals have looked at it in the same way before. I think you mentioned.
Yeah, and absolutely. And if I can draw an analogy to one of my previous employers, Airbus. Airbus is a crazy business model. You build the cockpit in France, you build the wings in UK, you build the tailplane in Spain, and you build the fuselage in Germany, and then you ship it all to America to build it. But what makes Airbus such a great company is the diversity and the different interdisciplinary skills and the different nationalities that are all working on the topic. I mean, and this is why we're so blessed here in this part of the world, because particularly here in Dubai, we don't have an issue with diversity, because everybody, you know, is coming from all over, and this is what makes life, and in procurement as well, you know, and this is something I've seen since my time here, is, you know, you working with different cultures, different nationalities more than ever in the procurement world. It just makes life not only more interesting, but in many cases more profitable, because you get better solutions from that.
Fantastic, and I'll draw back to your previous example where you spoke about, you know, looking to consolidate the purchase of maybe the seats in the plane with the information systems and whatever else, and that really is blue sky thinking outside the box, which doesn't necessarily need to come from the industry, as you say.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes.
Absolutely.
New ideas are always welcome.
Absolutely. So, look, in the interest of time, we'll go to one final question, and quite an interesting one and a topical one. Obviously, with the current issues that are going on around the region geopolitically, and the question here from Talent is in relation to the Red Sea, travel issues. How does that impact procurement in the aviation industry? How do these almost geopolitical issues impact the day-to-day of procurement in a travel company?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say there are too many direct impacts, because there's not too much aviation parts or parts of the aviation supply chain that are being stored on container ships that are floating around the Red Sea. Nevertheless, when you learn about it in the news, it starts to ring some alarm bells from an aviation procurement perspective. So first of all, insurance premiums for logistics. So, you know, a rising tide raises all of the ships. So insurance premiums just rise everywhere. Doesn't matter what form of transport you're using. Also, a lot of aviation parts are shipped around, particularly urgent, what we call AOG parts, aircraft on ground parts, are shipped on airplanes. But if the belly, what we call the belly capacity inside an aircraft, is taken up by goods that would have been shipped by sea, then first of all, you have a capacity issue. You may not be able to get your aircraft part in time. And second of all, you have a cost issue, because the yields on cargo capacity in aircraft just simply go through the roof. Yeah, so that's just one impact. So you have to be very careful about what are the indirect impacts of such a situation. Yeah, I mean, not going a bit further away from the Red Sea, but I remember when I was back at Lufthansa, and I went to see a subsidiary of Lufthansa, so Brussels Airlines, and the buyer came to me and said, "Hey James, we've got this big problem with champagne." I said, "Oh, it's a good problem to have if you have a problem with champagne." He said, "No, we can't get." The champagne producer won't produce the champagne for business class because the aluminium that's used to tie up the cork to the bottle is coming from Ukraine. And of course, with the Ukraine situation, there was no aluminium coming out of Ukraine anymore. So, you know, and you would never think that, you know, the geopolitical action that's taking place in Ukraine can have an impact on the delivery of champagne to a business class passenger on Brussels Airlines. So yeah, so it's you have to think a little bit out of the box, and think, okay, well, what could be the potential impacts here? Yeah, you know, and you know, if there's an increase in price based on the components that are in the containers in the Red Sea, that can, you know, and that may be a semi-finished component, which leads to a finished component, you know, which then the cost increase is passed on, and ultimately, you know, us as an airline, we get you know, we have to pay the price at the end of the day. So you have to, and again, this is where the technology side comes in, because hopefully in the future the technology will be able to tell us what these impacts are and even suggest mitigating actions to keep the costs low.
So many moving parts, as I say, to pardon a very, very bad pun. But James, thanks so much for your insights. It's been a fascinating delve into procurement and aviation procurement and procurement at a senior level anyway. Loads of questions. Unfortunately, we didn't get through all of them in the time given. We'll probably have to allocate more time next time, or alternatively have a part 2 with James Westgarth. We'll see what his timing is like. If anyone has any further questions outside the session, please just email them to us at mena.inquiries@cips.org. We can pass them over to James, or you can contact him yourself. I'm sure he'll be on LinkedIn or other various ways of media. But apart from that, just thank you so much for joining us for the first session of Ask the CPO. Thank you to James for being our first guest. It's been riveting. We're looking forward to the next session. And so look out on your emails, and we look forward to welcoming you all there. So James, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. All the best. Thank you again, James. Goodbye.
As a member of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, CIPS, no matter where you are in the world, you will always be a part of a global network that shares your common interests and challenges. CIPS is a not-for-profit membership organisation and the awarding body for the procurement and supply profession, committed to driving positive change and improving professional standards worldwide. Being a member of CIPS means you are a key part of that mission, helping to improve ethical and sustainable supply, promoting and encouraging equality, diversity and inclusion, and supporting anti-slavery in supply chains. CIPS offers dedicated support and tailored benefits for you at every stage of your career, from student to MSIPS and beyond. Membership demonstrates your professional potential to employers, clients and peers, and will boost your career prospects and secure the recognition you deserve. Develop your knowledge and expertise, enhance your performance and advance your career.
CIPS has been there in my journey, in my career, ever since day one, and it adds real value.
Without having my MSIPS, I don't think I would be at the level that I'm at today without it.
I'm now able to understand the strategic implication of procurement decisions, manage complex procurement projects, build a strong relationship with suppliers, and identify and mitigate the risk.
Shape your future with confidence, with access to practical support and resources.
I had an amazing time when I studied. My tutors were brilliant. They really brought the subject to life, and it really caught my interest.
With the chartered status, you do the ethics test, which is a brilliant addition to the qualification because it just gives you more in terms of modern slavery, understanding like diversity and inclusion, challenges around environment, sustainability.
Achieve career success as demand for qualified procurement and supply professionals increases in today's ever-changing world.
So being a part of CIPS, I believe, has really helped progress and fast-track my career to date.
It's actually widened the roles I can apply for.
Being MSIPS sets you apart from your peers. You are chartered. You are on par with the chartered accountants, with the chartered engineers. You are a chartered buyer. That makes you the expert in the room.
Be a part of a global network of procurement and supply professionals to get connected, build your network, and to give back.
Being part of a global community of professionals is really important. So there's lots of different opportunities that come your way relevant to expanding your network all through the sort of community that's built around the CIPS membership.
Attend the branch events, courses, workshop to enhance your knowledge on the topic, and also it gives the opportunity to network with their peers during that courses.
It's brilliant to be able to use the community to talk to other people within the profession and knowledge share.
It's a fabulous networking opportunity as well.
Evidence your professionalism and demonstrate credibility.
It shows that you are a credible person in your field. It is a globally recognized qualification, and being chartered gives you that additional tick that actually you are investing in continually learning.
It shows to employees that you're a committed procurement professional.
CIPS membership, a world of possibilities, with you every step of the way.